hello there and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Casey and I'm the designer behind the indie sewing pattern company Pattern Scout. Today's video falls into the category of things that aren't super exciting but are very useful and practical for your sewing practice. That's right, folks. Today we are going to be talking about seam finishes. Buckle up. So I know you've seen the title of this video and it is called My Favorite Seam Finishes, and that is because there are a lot of different types of seam finishes, and I really feel like you can finish your garments any way you darn well choose. I am not a stickler on this kind of thing. If you're sewing and it makes you happy, then you can do it however you want. But these are the seam finishes that I find the most personally satisfying when I'm trying to achieve a beautifully finished handmade garment. I do have a couple of serger or overlocker seam finishes, but the rest of them are all finishes that you can accomplish on a regular sewing machine. You don't need any special equipment or fancy presser feet or anything like that. You just need the knowledge of this sewing tutorial and a little bit of patience, which is basically what sewing requires is a lot of patience. Sewing requires a lot of patience sometimes. I've also included chapters for each section of this video, so if you want to skip ahead to a specific technique, you can just click on the timestamps in the description below. Okay, let's start finishing some seams. One of the easiest and most straightforward and cleanest ways to sew with knits and stretch fabrics is to use a serger or an overlocker. And this just creates a stitch that wraps around the edge of the fabric. It also trims the fabric, and it's just very clean, and it also gives you a lot of stretch capability in the stitch. So this is really what I prefer to use when I'm sewing with knits. However, if you don't have access to a serger or an overlocking machine, you can still do stretch stitches on a regular sewing machine. So here I'm just doing a zigzag stitch with a 3mm stitch length and stitch width. And this will give me a stretch stitch that allows me to stretch the seam in this knit fabric. And most sewing machines come with multiple stretch stitch options, so definitely play around with those and see which ones you like best. But this is totally suitable for sewing with knits, and because most knits do not fray, you really don't have to even worry about finishing the raw edges. A serger is also great for finishing the raw edges of woven fabrics. So I'll usually start with a straight stitch that is at the seam allowance recommended in the pattern on my sewing machine. And then I'll take it over to the serger to clean up the raw edges, and I'll usually trim down the seam allowance to anywhere between 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch and use the serger to clean up all of the raw edges. I like to use this method if I'm wanting a project to go a little bit more quickly, or if I'm not as concerned about the seam allowances showing on my project. And it really does provide a nice professional finish. It's very comfortable to wear, and this is one of the methods that I probably use the most often in most of my sewing projects. But the rest of the seam finishes that I'm going to show you in this video actually do not require a serger at all. And the first one that I will show you is a French seam. For the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and mark the wrong side of the fabric just so that you can tell the difference between the wrong side and the right side. And I'm putting these two fabrics wrong side together first. I'll pin along the seam allowance to hold it in place. For this demonstration, I'm going to be using a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and so my first seam is actually going to be 3/8 inch. You can see that I've got my wrong sides together here. Then I will trim the seam allowance down to about 1/8 inch. So I'm using a ruler and a rotary cutter here to get a nice clean cut, but I've trimmed that down pretty close to the seam allowance, making sure that I don't actually cut through the seam. Next, I will press the seam allowance open, and I like to press this on both sides just to get it nice and flat. Then I'm going to fold this back over so that now right sides are together, and I'm going to press that seam folded in the opposite direction so that now the fold is covering the raw seam edges that I just trimmed. And again, I'm pressing from both sides. And one of the tools that I really like to use for setting my seams is a tailor's clapper. And this is just a wooden block that helps cool the seams and set them really nice and crisp. It comes in actually very handy. I use it a lot. So now I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew another seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance this time. And this seam will encase the raw edges of the first seam that we sewed and trimmed. Once that seam is finished, I'll usually press the seam allowance toward one side. And this seam allowance is really nice for lighter weight fabrics, so like a rayon or a silk or even a lighter weight cotton. because it just creates a really nice finish. If you have a lighter weight fabric, it's not going to be quite as bulky. And this is actually a lyocell 12 that I'm using for the example, but yeah, this is a really beautiful finish for some of your nicer lighter weight garments. Another seam finish that is kind of similar to a French seam but is more suitable for heavier weight fabrics is a flat felled seam. So this is a seam finish that you'll probably notice a lot in jeans and more heavy fabrics because it conceals the raw edges. It's actually a very strong stitch, and it also is not quite as bulky as a French seam would be for some of those heavier fabrics. So to start, I did a 5/8 inch seam allowance, right sides together, and then I'm going to press that seam allowance open. Next, I'm going to trim one side of the seam allowance in half, and I usually trim it a little bit more than half. So for this one, I'm trimming it down to probably about 1/8 of an inch. And you can see that one side of the seam allowance is trimmed short, and I've left the other side long. Next, I'll press both seam allowances over to one side. In this case, I'm pressing everything over to the right. And I will fold the longer side of the seam allowance over the one that I just trimmed. And I'm just pressing that in place with the raw edge of the seam allowance back at the actual seam line. And you can see that that covers that raw edge of the one that I trimmed. Then I'm going to use my tailor's clapper, which I love, to set the seam, and I'm going to press all of this over to the left side so that now all of the raw edges are concealed in the fold. And using my tailor's clapper again. And the tailor's clapper is totally optional, but I really love to use that. So I'll stitch down that fold along the entire seam to secure that in place and hide all of the raw edges. And I'm stitching this from the wrong side. If you have a sewing machine that is a little bit wonky for the bobbin side of your stitch, then you may want to flip this over and stitch it from the right side, but just kind of feel around for that to make sure that you're stitching right along the edge of that fold. And here's how it looks from the exterior. So from the interior, you have the 2 rows of stitching. From the exterior, you can just see the one where you top stitch that fold down. And all of the seams are nicely concealed. So a Hong Kong seam finish is really nice for heavier weight fabrics where the seams are going to be exposed and the fabric might be a little too heavy to do something like a French seam or a flat felled seam. It might be a little too bulky. So a Hong Kong seam is a great application for that. So like a jacket that is unlined, for example, is probably the most common use of this type of seam finish. So again, I'll start with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then I'll press that seam allowance open. And you can buy pre-made bias binding for this process, but I'm going to be making my own. So I'm just aligning my fabric on my cutting table at a 45-degree angle, and I will cut bias strips at a 45-degree angle to the grain of fabric. And this is just going to give the strips a little bit of extra stretch and give and make them a little bit more malleable for finishing the seams. This is especially helpful around curved seams. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to be doing a straight seam. So I'll align my bias binding with the raw edge of one side of the seam allowance and pin this in place. And I'm also just going to trim my bias binding to the length of my seam. Then I'll sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance down the entire length of this seam, and I only want to attach the bias binding to the seam allowance, so I'm making sure to flip the garment out of the way when I do this. And here you can see that I've got it sewn to the seam allowance, and there's the other side of the seam allowance underneath. Now I just want to press the binding to the other side so that it covers that raw edge of the seam allowance and the binding. Then I'm going to fold the binding over the raw edges and align the raw edge of the binding with the original seam line. And if you don't have a tailor's clapper, another option is to use a box or something straight and flat like this that you can use to cool down your seams. Now I'm just going to fold all of that back over to the right and press that in place so that the raw edge of the binding is underneath the seam allowance. And I'm going to stitch in the ditch here along this binding seam, but first I just want to pin this in place. So I'm pinning the binding in place, catching that bottom side of the binding with a pin, and I'm pinning right in that seam, and I'm only pinning the binding to the seam allowance, and then I'll stitch in the ditch. So again, I want to make sure that I have the garment flipped out of the way, so I'm only sewing on the seam allowance, and I'm just taking my stitching right down the center of that seam. Now normally I would be using a thread that is the same color as my garment fabric, but for this demonstration, just so you can see where I'm stitching, I'm using the orange thread. And you'll notice that I get a little bit out of line here in a couple of places, but it's really okay, especially if you're using a thread that is the same color as your project. It really won't show up that much. So I've done this for both sides here now, and you can see that that raw edge is tacked underneath. And here is the orange stitching, and here is the side that I did with a thread color that is the same color as my project. So you can see it's pretty much invisible. A bias bound seam is kind of similar to a Hong Kong seam, except that the bias binding is actually tucked under on the underside so that all of the raw edges are concealed. And this one is a little bit harder to get a really neat finish on and to have your stitching look really neat and consistent, but it is an option if you want all of those raw edges concealed. So I've started with a 5/8 inch seam allowance again, and I'm just going to press this open. Next, I'll grab my bias tape, and this time I'm going to attach the bias tape on the underside of that seam allowance. So again, I'll pin this in place. And also, again, with a 1/4 inch seam allowance to attach the binding to the seam allowance. And I'm going to press that binding away from the garment. So I'm pressing it over the raw edges of where I attached the binding to the seam allowance. Then I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to press that remaining portion of the visible binding in half so that the raw edge of the binding meets up with the raw edge of the seam allowance. And I'm just using my tailor's clapper to get that fold nice and crisp. Then I'm going to fold everything over the seam allowance and align that folded edge with the seam where I attach the binding to the seam allowance, if that makes any sense at all. And I just want that folded edge to just barely cover that seam line. And again, I'll use my tailor's clapper, my favorite tool. So now I have this pressed so that the stitched edge is on the underside of the seam allowance, and that edge that I just folded over is on the top of the seam allowance, the part that's going to be exposed. And I just want to pin this in place so that that loose fold is pinned in place when I sew this down. I just want that folded edge to kind of align with the edge on the bottom, and I'm going to stitch this in place, but I'm just going to stitch right along the edge. This is called an edge stitch, and I want to make sure that I'm just adhering that edge, the loose edge of that bias binding on top of the seam allowance. And for this, it doesn't really matter if you catch the bottom of the binding because we've already sewn that in place when we first sewed this to the seam allowance. So I'm just going right along the edge there just to try to get it as neat and nice as possible. So here you can see it's right along the edge, and here is how it looks with both sides done, and all of the raw edges are tucked in. And again, I would normally use a thread that is matching the fabric, but for this, I just wanted you guys to be able to see how that seam looks with a contrasting thread. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did enjoy this video and you'd like to see more from me, please be sure to subscribe and hit that little bell icon. That way you'll be notified when I release new videos in the future. Okay, I think that is all I have for you today. I will see you in the next video. Bye. Okay, let me start from the top. Blah, blah, blah. But to get compliments on the finishing is also kind of another little like secret love of mine when it comes to sewing my clothes. Should I try to go through that one more time? I think I will. Okay, that sounds kind of silly.